A sudden blizzard struck on Christmas night. At a small, rundown diner, Keisha was struggling with no electricity, a broken heater, and her 2-year-old son shivering from the cold. Suddenly, there was a noise outside. 25 Hells Angels appeared, lined up at her diner's door. They begged her for shelter to escape the snowstorm. Though terrified, her kind heart led her to invite them inside. Together, they cooked and chatted happily with each other. She had no idea that just 3 days later, her act of kindness would summon 1,500 roaring motorcycles to her doorstep, changing not only her life, but an entire community forever. Before we go back, let us know where you're watching from and subscribe because tomorrow I've got something extra special for you. The clock on the cracked kitchen wall read 3:47 in the morning when Keisha Williams finally allowed herself to sit down. Her calloused hands trembled as she counted the crumpled bills scattered across the wooden table. $7.32. That was all that stood between her 2-year-old son Marcus and an empty belly come morning. Keisha pressed her palms against her tired eyes, feeling the weight of exhaustion seep into her bones. At 32 years old, she looked at least 40. Her dark skin had lost its youthful glow, replaced with the dull sheen of someone who worked 3 jobs just to survive. The small house around her creaked in the winter wind, a constant reminder of how alone she truly was. Marcus slept peacefully in the corner of the kitchen, curled up in a makeshift bed she had fashioned from old blankets and couch cushions. The heater in his bedroom had broken 2 weeks ago, and she couldn't afford to fix it, so she kept him close, where the warmth from the stove could reach him. His tiny chest rose and fell with each breath, completely unaware that his mother was drowning in a sea of unpaid bills and broken dreams. The house sat isolated at the end of Maple Street in Detroit, separated from the other homes by an empty lot that nobody wanted to develop. It was as if the neighborhood had deliberately pushed her to the margins, just like everything else in her life. The white families who lived in the nicer houses down the street rarely acknowledged her existence. When they did, it was usually with suspicious glances or whispered conversations that stopped abruptly when she walked by. "Why did you have to leave us, Jerome?" she whispered to the empty room, her voice barely audible above the humming of the old refrigerator. Her ex-husband had walked out 8 months ago, claiming he needed to find himself. He had found himself all right, living with a 23-year-old waitress in Tennessee, completely ignoring the child support payments that were supposed to help keep his son fed and housed. The divorce papers sat in a folder on top of the refrigerator, stamped with red ink that might as well have been blood for all the pain they represented. Keisha's phone buzzed against the table, making her jump. A text message from her manager at the cleaning company glowed on the screen. "Don't bother coming in tomorrow. We're letting you go. Your kid was crying too much during your shift yesterday. Customers complained." The words hit her like a physical blow. She stared at the message, reading it over and over again, hoping the letters would somehow rearrange themselves into something less devastating. That was the 3rd job she had lost in 2 months. The laundromat had fired her when Marcus got sick and she had to bring him to work. The diner let her go when she fell asleep during her shift after working 18 hours straight between all 3 jobs. "How am I supposed to work if I can't find anyone to watch you, baby?" she said, looking at her sleeping son. Daycare was $200 a week she didn't have. Family help was non-existent since her mother had passed away 3 years earlier, taking with her the last person who truly understood Keisha's struggles. Her mother's voice echoed in her memory, stern but loving. "Keisha, honey, remember what I taught you about my grandmother's fried chicken recipe? That secret blend of spices has been in our family for generations. One day, when times get tough, that recipe might just save you." At the time, Keisha had smiled and nodded, never imagining she would need salvation from a handful of herbs and spices. But now, sitting in her cold kitchen with her last $7, her mother's words felt like a lifeline thrown to a drowning woman. She walked to the old wooden cabinet where she kept her mother's recipe box. The index cards inside were yellowed with age, covered in her mother's careful handwriting. The fried chicken recipe was there, along with detailed instructions for sides and sauces that made her mouth water just reading them. Her mother ran a small soul food restaurant when Keisha was young, before the neighborhood changed and the customers stopped coming. Maybe it's time to try again, she said to herself, though doubt immediately crept into her voice. The next morning, Keisha used her last $7 to buy chicken and basic ingredients. She set up 2 folding tables in her living room, creating a makeshift dining area next to her tiny kitchen. She made a handwritten menu on poster board and propped it against the front window. Mama's Kitchen, it read in careful letters. Authentic soul food made with love. Marcus sat in his high chair, babbling happily as the smell of perfectly seasoned fried chicken filled the house. The secret was in the blend of spices her mother had taught her, a combination that made the coating crispy and flavorful in a way that made people close their eyes and sigh with satisfaction. But as the hours passed, reality set in. She watched through her window as people walked by on their way to the bus stop. Some slowed down when they saw the menu in her window, but when they saw her dark face through the glass, they quickened their pace and looked away. Mrs. Henderson from 3 houses down actually stopped and read the menu. Keisha felt her heart jump with hope and rushed to open the door. "Good morning, Mrs. Henderson. Would you like to try some of my fried chicken? It's made from my grandmother's recipe." Mrs. Henderson's expression changed the moment she saw her dark face. The older white woman's eyes narrowed with suspicion and something that looked uncomfortably like disgust. "I don't think so," she said, backing away from the door. "I heard about you. Single mother, no husband around, probably don't even know who the father is. I don't eat food from people like that." The words cut deep, but Keisha forced herself to keep smiling. "The food is really good, ma'am. I promise it's clean and fresh." "I said no," Mrs. Henderson snapped. "And you shouldn't be running a business out of your house. This is a decent neighborhood. Keep your kind of trouble to yourself." Keisha watched her neighbor storm away, her chest tight with humiliation and anger. She closed the door and leaned against it, feeling the weight of rejection settle over her like a heavy blanket. Marcus looked up at her from his high chair, his innocent eyes wide and trusting. "I'm here, baby," she whispered, picking him up and holding him close. "Mama's going to figure this out, I promise." But as she looked around her empty restaurant, smelling the delicious food that no one wanted to buy, Keisha wondered if some promises were too big for one person to keep. Outside, the Detroit winter pressed against her windows, and inside, the isolation felt just as cold. The phone rang again, another bill collector, no doubt. She let it go to voicemail knowing she had nothing to tell them that they wanted to hear. Tomorrow she would have to find another job, assuming anyone would hire a single Black mother with a history of bringing her child to work. Marcus reached up and touched her face with his small hand, as if he could sense her sadness. "Mama," he said, one of the few words he knew clearly. "I'm here, baby," she replied, her voice thick with tears she refused to let fall. "Mama's right here." As the afternoon light faded through her windows, Keisha Williams held her son close and wondered how much longer she could keep fighting a world that seemed too determined to keep her down. The smell of her mother's fried chicken recipe still lingered in the air, a reminder of dreams that felt increasingly out of reach. 3 weeks had passed since Mrs. Henderson's cruel words, and Keisha's small restaurant venture had attracted exactly 4 customers. 4 brave souls who had tasted her mother's fried chicken recipe and declared it the best they had ever eaten. But 4 customers couldn't pay the rent or keep the lights on, and the stack of unpaid bills on her kitchen table had grown taller each day. December 23rd arrived with an ominous gray sky that promised trouble. The weather reports had been warning about it for days, the worst snowstorm to hit Detroit in 20 years. Keisha stood at her kitchen window, watching the first flakes begin to fall. as she stirred a pot of chicken and dumplings. At least she had managed to stock up on supplies before the storm hit. The few customers she had served had given her enough money to buy ingredients in bulk, thinking optimistically about the Christmas rush that never came. Mama cold, Marcus said from his high chair, rubbing his small hands together. Keisha turned up the heat on the stove and wrapped him in an extra blanket. The house felt colder than usual, but she assumed it was just the storm approaching. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the windows with increasing intensity. By evening, the snow was falling in thick sheets that obscured everything beyond her front yard. The weather had become so severe that even the few cars that normally passed by her isolated house had disappeared completely. The silence was eerie, broken only by the howling wind and the occasional creak of tree branches bending under